Hi, welcome to creating an export script with Taleo Connect client, also known as TCC. What we're going to do today is create a new export script using TCC. So let's get started. So what you see here first is the TCC window. So it is assumed that you have TCC installed and are able to log in. So once you're in Taleo Connect client in the software, to create a new export script, what you need to do is select File, New, and then in the new menu, select New Export Wizard. So when you export the wizard, when you select the wizard, you're going to be requested to select two things. First, the product version. So here I'm using the latest version of recruiting, so recruiting 17.4. If I want to use, for example, if I want to do an organization export, I could use Smart Org. And usually when you create a new script, you select the most recent version. So I could do an organization export using the product Smart Org. So you see that the list of available export entities are different when I change product. So the first thing, I'm going to select recruiting 17.4 because I want to do a recruiting export. Then the second thing you need to select is the main entity of your export script. So what are you going to be exporting? You're not going to be limited to objects from that entity, but that will be your main entity. So for example, if I say I want to extract external candidates out of the Taleo system, my main entity could be candidate. So you see that you have a filter window that you can use where you can type in a few letters of entities that you are looking for. And you'll see that now I can find my candidate entity. So as soon as I've selected my product and my main entity, I can select the create new export, click finish, and it's going to build that new export script for me. So it's only the template or the frame that is provided, the structure. So now I need to populate, change the settings and populate this script with the fields that I need. So you see that at the bottom, there are 6 tabs for an export script. We're actually going to look at the first 4. We're not going to address the advanced tab today. That's going to be for another presentation. And the source tab is actually just a visual representation of the XML script that you're building. So behind the scenes, when we're going to save that script, it's going to be an XML file that's going to be saved on the server. And the source tab shows me the content of that XML file. So of course here, it's very small. It doesn't have a lot of information because I haven't started editing the script. But that's just to tell you what the source tab is, and you see that it's read-only. So it's really just a visual aid. It's not used that much. So really, we're going to focus on the first 4 tab, which is what we need to generate a new export script, starting with the general tab. So in the general tab, we're simply going to select a few standard options for the script itself. So it's really just configuration items, starting with the locale. So you can change what is the main language of your script. So usually English is by default what is selected. We're going to keep the alias. That's if you want to use subqueries, you could give a name to your main query, but it's not going to be part of today's presentation. So really the first thing that you need to change when you start a new TCC export script is the export mode. And if I show you what's in there, you see that there's 4 values that you can select from. So there's 2 XML formats that we can use or 2 CSV formats. So really what this drives is the format, the main format of the exported file that we're going to create. Do we want to create an XML file, or do we want to create what is most common, a CSV file, a comma separated values file that could be, for example, open in Excel. So what is most frequent is the CSV file, and you see that there's 2, but the CSV report is the one that you need to use, mostly if you have a multi-language environment. But by default, it's best practice to always select CSV report as the export mode. That's what 99.9% of the exports are built with. Next, you have a few check boxes. So these are pretty self-explanatory. We're going to go through them, but the first one, do you want to have a header present in your export or not? So if you select that checkbox, you're going to have a first row with a header in your final exported file. The second one, the CSV value delimiter. So the reason it is grayed out is simply that there's a default value when it's not clicked. So it doesn't mean it's not used. as opposed to the header. If you don't click it, there's no header. Here, you're always going to have a value delimiter and a quotation characters and a record delimiter, but you can change the defaults. So by default, if you all leave those blanks, the value delimiter is a comma, the quotation character is a double quote, and the record delimiter is the line feed or carriage return, right? So what changes most often is the value delimiter, but you should not expect to change the other two. These are rarely changed. So the value delimiter, for example, I could put a pipe in here so that my export will be pipe delimited. Each value will have a pipe in between them. Finally, the advanced section we're going to skip for today. It's not going to be part of the presentation today. So that's all there is to the general tab. Really, just make sure that the main language is what you need. So for example, if you select a multi-language field like a requisition title, it will show up in that language, unless you specify in your export a different language. So then you just select the type of export, put your settings, and we're ready to actually build the export script, starting with the next tab, which is the projections. So with TCC, in an export, a projection is basically the name of a field that is extracted. So if I have 5 fields that I need to extract, I'm going to have 5 projections in this tab here. So as you can see, on the left side, I have an empty window. That's where I'm going to list the projections that I want to have, or the fields that I want to have in my export. On the right side is the entire data model, right? All the fields that are available in recruiting, which is the model I selected at the beginning of the process. And the main folder is the candidate folder, because that's what I identified as my main entity, right? So you see that all below the main entity are all the fields or attributes for a candidate: email address, first name, last name, internal. And then I'm going to have subqueries with other entities. So like I said, I'm not limited to candidate. It's my main entity, but I could go in here and select, for example, information on the applications for each of those candidates. So I could select, for example, what is their current step and status, what requisitions they have applied to. Okay. So the review of the actual data models going through these fields is not part, of course, of this presentation. So how do we add projections to our script? There's actually many ways that we can do that. So when you want to add a standard field, right? So let's say, for example, I'm going to add the first name as is. I'm not going to transform it in my export. So there's actually 3 different ways that I can bring over this field. I could drag and drop it from the data model to my projection window. That would be a first way. So if I just drag and drop, it's going to create the first name field, and you have the details of the field in the center window. Another way that I could do the same thing is just click the add button, and you see that I have 5 options. But if I select the first one, add a field projection, it's just going to create an entry in my projection list. But you see that the field says path, right? So that basically is a default value that is brought over by TCC, and we need to replace it. Okay? So again, there's 2 ways we could do that. The first way is if I know the exact name of the field or location in the data model, I could type it in. So I could manually type in last name, because I know that it's the name of an object in TCC, in the data model, right? So I manually typed it in. What I could also do is, when I click the add a field projection, is take the field in the data model on the right side and drag it not to the projection window, but to over the path word, right? And you'll see that it's going to actually replace it, right? So it's another way to do it, but rarely used, because you just save dragging to the middle window versus dragging to the complete left side, which is a bit faster actually. So, but these are the 3 ways you can add a standard field. Okay, so right now I've added the first name, last name, and middle initial. So these are the 3 first column of my export. I'm actually going to also add the candidate number, which is a very useful field. So I'm going to take the number field, drag it over to the left side. Now I want to see my number field to show up on top. So what I can use is use the up and down buttons to move my field and change its location relative to the other fields. So in this case, I will bring it completely to the top. And you also notice that you have the opportunity or the option to put an alias for your field. The alias is actually going to be the header that you're going to see in your final extract. So that would be the name of the column that will show up in the result file. So for example, I could call it candidate ID. Just note that you're not able to put spaces in the header. I'm currently clicking on the bar space and it won't allow me. So you cannot have a space character in your projections header or alias. If I don't change the alias, right, it's going to show exactly as it is showing in the field box. Even if, for example, I select a field from the application subfolder, let's say I select the grade. So you see that if I bring over this field, there's going to be a comma here, and it's going to be part of the header if I leave it like this. So it's always best practice to use aliases, mostly when you are selecting fields from subfolders, if you don't want to show the path as the header, but rather just the field name. So these are the ways that you can add a standard field in your projections. But there are other types of fields that you can add. You can add either formatted date. So let's say you have a date field, you could have a specific format when you extract it, or you could add a function or a calculated field. So let's see how we can do those too. So the first thing to note about the formatted date, so you see that if I click on the add button, the second option I have is add a formatted date projections. So when I click OK, you see that in the middle window, I have a little bit more information. I have an extra parameter, which is the date format. So again, here you see that by default, when I click the button, it gave the header alias. I'll need to change that. It gave path as the field, so I'll need to change that. And if I want to have a different date format, I could change it here as well. So of course, what's going to be important when you use that functionality, the formatted date projection, is to make sure that you are using a date field to apply the function. Else, you're going to get an error at runtime. So the best thing to do, if you want to make sure, is when you select a field in the data model, you will see at the bottom, in the bottom section, what data type that field is. So for example, here, the bill rate is a double data type. If I select date of entry, you see that this one is a date field, so I could use a formatted date on this field. So let's use it as our example. I'm going to bring over the date of entry. I'm actually going to use the same value, date of entry, as my header or alias. And I'm just going to change the format and put backspace instead of dashes. Right? I could do it like this. I could add hours, minutes, seconds also. So you can play around with the format. You can use the standard Oracle formatting options in that box. So last but not least is the add a function projection. So if I want to do a calculation, I could select that option, add a function projection. And you see that when I select this option, there's a box, a drop-down that opens up with all the possible functions that are available in TCC. So when I do an extract, I can use any of these functions on my export. So a good example, for example, I might want to concatenate things. So if I select, once I select my function and click on the OK button, what's going to show up in the middle section will be different depending on the function that we use, right? So we saw the example of the date of entry. These are the fields that I need to populate. Here, in this case, I'm using a concatenate. So this is the parameters that I have for that function. So basically, in that window here, I will list all the fields that I want to see concatenated in the final export. And because it's a calculated field, I'll need to give it an alias. So in my case here, I'm going to create something called primary key. That's the name I'm going to give to my column. And what I'm going to put it equal to, I want it to show candidate ID underscore and then the actual ID of the candidate. So in order to do that, I'm going to look at my field. So I could add or remove fields. So I can concatenate 5, 6, 7, 8 fields. In my case, I'm going to need two only. So the first value that I'm going to have, once you select the field from the middle section, you just change its type and its value. So the first type that I'm going to have is going to be a string, and it's going to be candidate underscore. And the second parameter in my concatenate function will be a field, and I'm going to select the actual number field under candidate. And I'm going to bring it over the path word here so that it replaces the value with the path of my number. So you see that my column here, primary key, would consist of the string candidate underscore followed by the actual ID of that candidate. So that's how you create a function. So you have you can go to the list of functions. You can find explanations on the Oracle support site for all of those. But the ones that are mostly used is the concatenation, the decode, and one that is very often used is the replace null, where you can select a field, but if it's not populated, you would select a different field, right? So a good example of this, if I just quickly show you something that we do a lot, is when you look at experience records, right? So let's say, or let's say education record, rather. We know that a candidate could select the name of their school either from a drop-down in Taleo, or they could populate a free text field. So if I want to extract that information, but in a single field, what I could do is use the replace null function and always select first the name or the description from the institution folder. So I'm just going to drag it over the path word here, right? So that's the standard institution or school from the dropdown. And if it's not populated, if it's null, I'm going to replace it with the other institution name, which is the field that contains the free text institution, right? And I could just put the alias or the header to be school name, right? So what this function would do is it would select the name of the school from that was selected from the dropdown. But if there's none that was selected from the dropdown, it's going to show up the value from the free text. That allows you to have both fields showing up in the same column, knowing that they are mutually exclusive in the Taleo system, right? So that covers all the ways that you can create a projection when building an export. You might have noticed that there's another option. We're not going to use the add a multi-language field in the example today, but it's very simple to use. But I want to show you the add a complex projection tab, because this one is very useful. And the reason you would have a complex projection basically means that you manually type in your code. So it requires a bit more knowledge of TCC or to have a reference script, so a script that you can copy to allow you to build that projection. And the two main reasons you're going to create a projection is if either you want to apply a function on a function, right? So we saw that we can only add one function, but let's say that I want to do a replace null on my concatenation. I could do that, but right now I cannot do it by clicking on the buttons. I'll need to manually type in the projection. So this is more advanced. You need to know XML and a little bit of the TCC scripting jargon or terminology, but you can always rely on an already existing script to do that. I mentioned the source earlier. So if I go into the source menu, so I know that the primary key concatenate here is going to be part of my complex projection. So what I'm going to do is just copy, instead of retyping everything, I'm going to come in my projection, in my source, find where I have my primary key, and I'm just going to copy the concatenate function. Right? And I'm going to go into my projection and start by pasting this here. So again, you can use an existing script if you have one to see how you can write this. The alias goes in as an attribute of the projection. So I could put it here. It's called alias equals, and you put the value in between double quotes. So I'm going to call it concatenate and replace. Okay. So I'm going to apply two functions. When I do my complex projections, you notice at the bottom, it says the source is valid. It's always going to validate as I type in. So as soon as it's no longer valid, it will show at the bottom. So it's a good way to make sure that your script is okay before you change windows. So I have a concatenate projection just to show you what would happen if I leave it like that, knowing that this is a standard field, right? Or only one occurrence of a projection. It's exactly the same code as primary key. So you see that I created it as a complex projection, and that's my code. But what if I navigate out of it and come back? You see that it no longer shows as a complex projection. It shows like the regular primary key field because TCC knows how to interpret that function. Where it's going to become different is when I apply a function on a function. So we're going to do the same thing. Copy everything here. Sorry, I took it. So that's again, my same projection. But what I'm going to do now is apply a function on the function. So that concatenate function, if it's null, right? So I'm going to use the replace null function. If the concatenation is null, I'm going to put a string that will say no candidate IDs. And I'm going to close that string. Like this. And finally close that tab. So you don't have to remember that part, as knowing how to write complex projections comes with experience, but it's just good to know that it exists and that you can use it. So you see that my source is valid, so I could now navigate out of this field, and when I come back, my code will be there. But you see that TCC doesn't know how to represent this graphically like it did when there's only one function applied. Here, it stays as a complex projection because I'm applying a function on a function. So I'm concatenating stuff, and if that stuff is blank, I'm replacing it with another value. So that's what a complex projection is. I mentioned that it's useful for two things. That's the first one, when you need to apply multiple functions on a single field. Another good useful use of this is if you want to hard code a value for all records, so you want that column to show the value ABC for every row. So I could create a complex projection and just have the string as my description of my field. And I will give it the other default, right? Default to ABC. So this, just because I don't have a function, I just have a string ABC. I don't have any reference to a field. If my record extracts 10 records, if my extract returns 10 records, I'm going to have ABC in all 10 of them. They're all going to show that same value because I'm forcing a string. So it's useful when you want to force the same value in a column for all records. So that completes the projection section. So now I need to go to the filter section where I'm going to define what filters or what conditions I need to apply to my script. Because if I was to run it exactly like it is right now, there's no filters. It means that it would extract all candidates from your database. Every candidate that exists in your zone would be extracted. So usually we don't extract everything. We always have filters in our export. And this is what this tab is for. So the filters are going to be our conditions on our project. So it works pretty much the same way as the projections, meaning that there's two main ways you can add a filter. You can either use the add button to add either a simple or complex filter, or you can drag and drop a field from the data model up to the filter section. You'll notice that when I do that, when I do a drag and drop in the filters, by default, it will create an equal filter. Right? I can change it, but the options there are limited because it only shows me operations that apply to a single value or a single parameter. Here's what I mean. If I do a between, right? If I want to see that the value is between two other values, which is often done with dates, I need to click the add button and select add a simple filter. And then in the operator, I can select between. Right? You see that between has two values. That's why I don't see it when I do a drag and drop on a field. So if I bring over the creation date, it's going to create it as an equal filter by default, but I cannot change it to between. That's because I brought in one field, and by default, it gives me all the operators that only need one parameter value. So best practice, I always manually add them. It's as fast, and this way you always have all the options. So I always use the add button to create an operator. You see that I have here the between, equal, that's not equal, the greater than. So I have a lot of operators. They're all pretty self-explanatory. And the very last one, last run date, is used when you do an export where you want to be able to extract all the data since the last time you ran the integration. So whenever you use that last run date filter, you're going to see that all it requires is a date field as a parameter. Right? So I could bring over the creation date of the candidates, for example. So it means that every time I'm going to run this export, it's going to give me all the candidates that were created since the last time I ran the export. So if I run it daily, every day I would receive the candidates that were created in the last 24 hours. Right? So as far as creating your filters, it's the same approach. Like I said, it's easier to use the add button in this case. So I'm going to do that. And the first filter that we're going to add is adding an equal filter because I want to extract only external candidates, right? So I could do an actually equal or do not equal, right? I could do equals internal or not internal, right? So I'm going to use the equals filter. So you see that here I need to provide which field I need to do the conditions. So in this case, I'm going to use the internal application. It's a strange name. It should be internal candidate because it's really on the candidate level. So really this is a Boolean field. So it's a true or false, and it will be true if the candidate is internal. It will be false if the candidate is external. So in my case, I want to extract only external candidates. So I could say I want the internal application to be equal to the Boolean value of true. Sorry, false. So this would return all external candidates from the system, right? So the internal indicator is set to false. I could have, for example, select only people which have a first name equals to John. So if it's an equal, I can just drag and drop the field, and I could just say the first name equals to John. I could have between, like I said, dates are often used for with the between filter. So I could say, for example, I want to select candidates that were created between two dates, right? So I could say between January 1st of 2020 until December 31st of the same year, right? So this would select only candidates that were created between these two dates. So that's how you create your filters. And in the same way as with projections, we can have complex filters. So complex filters, again, there are two ways or two types of complex filter, or I should say two reasons why you would use complex filters. You might actually have a double filter, right? You want to be something to be equal or different than something. So you could have multiple conditions in the same complex filter. The main, so that's one reason you would have a complex filter if you have a real complex condition. But there's also a few filters that don't exist when you click the add button. They're not showing up in the list, but that are actually managed by TCC. So the one that is more often used that doesn't exist by default is the OR statement. So there's no statement that allows you to do a OR comparison in TCC. You need to use a complex filter, and the name of the filter is exactly that, query. So every tag starts with query, and it would be OR. So if I close my filter, so the way that I would use this filtering is very simple. Actually, I will have two conditions in the OR in between the OR tags. So for example, I could have an equal where it would say that the field first name equals to John, right? So I would have two objects that are equal: the field first name and the string John. Sorry about the typos. So that could be my first condition. So I can close the equal here. Or I could say, all right, I want the first name to be John, or I want the first name to, or I want the last name to be Smith. I'm actually going to copy this. So that's going to be my second parameter of my OR statement. And instead of first name, I'm going to have last name equals, and I just realized I have a few typos here. And finally, I would close the OR statement. So my source is valid. Sorry for the delay. The source is now valid. So you see that I can navigate out of it and come back, and it will still be there. So it's a complex filter, which will do it OR. So it will select candidates that either have the first name John or have the last name Smith. So that's how you would build a complex filter. So that completes the tabs of the conditions. So the last tab that we need to look at is the sorting. So the sorting is very self-explanatory, very simple. You can sort by multiple fields, and every time you're going to add a field, so let's say I want to sort by candidate number and then by last name, right? And so I just drag over the fields from right to left, and then you select each field and decide if it's going to be ascending or descending. So I could start by sorting by ascending candidate IDs and then by descending last name. So that's how the sorting will work. So we're going to skip the advanced. And again, if you remember the source, now you see there's more stuff in it. It's more populated because all my script that I just wrote is included in here. So I have all these fields that I'm going to be selecting. These are the filters that I'm going to apply to my script. And it's going to be sorted by these two fields. So that actually completes my export script. The last step is simply to save that script so that I don't lose my work. So that is straightforward. You just click on the save icon, navigate to where you want to save the script. So I'm going to use TCC scripts on my desktop, and I'm going to give this a name of candidate_export. You might notice if you look at the save as type, that it's going to add the extension for export scripts in TCC, which is _sq.xml. So I call my script candidate_export, click save. And if I navigate to that folder, you're going to see that the actual name that it gave it was candidate export _sq.xml, because that's an export script. So that completes today's presentation. The next step will be to build a config file so that we can execute this export. And that's going to be in a separate presentation. Thank you very much for attending today's presentation. Thank you.